Welcome to Top 10 Secret, the place where terrifying secrets and spine-chilling stories come to life. Today, we delve into a world of horror and darkness, where the daughters of the devil have appeared, spreading fear and nightmares wherever they go. Who are they? What curse binds them? Has anyone ever encountered them and lived to tell the tale? Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and make sure you're not alone, because these 10 terrifying stories might just haunt you for nights to come. Story 1. The Devil's Daughter. In the darkest corners of a cursed village, whispers of an unsettling presence had grown louder with each passing year. This was no ordinary tale of ghosts or haunted woods. It was the story of Lilith, the Devil's Daughter, a being so deceptively innocent in appearance that she lured her victims with a smile as wide as her hunger for destruction. Years ago, in the remote village of Black Hollow, a young couple, Martha and Samuel, prayed desperately for a child. Despite their devout prayers and offerings, they remained childless. One night, as Martha wandered the edge of the forest in despair, she encountered a figure cloaked in shadow. Its voice was soft yet cold, cutting through the air like the edge of a blade. "I can grant you a child," the figure whispered, "but every gift comes with a price." Blinded by longing, Martha agreed without hesitation. The figure extended a hand, its clawed fingers brushing against her stomach, and disappeared into the darkness. Months later, Martha gave birth to a baby girl with golden curls and sparkling eyes. They named her Lilith, marveling at her beauty and charm. The villagers, however, felt a sense of unease whenever they looked at the child. Her smile, though innocent, seemed too wide, her laughter echoing in ways that chilled the spine. As Lilith grew, strange occurrences began to plague the village. Livestock were found mutilated, crops withered overnight, and shadows seemed to linger unnaturally long in her presence. But it wasn't until her 5th birthday that the true nature of the child was revealed. During the celebration, Lilith ran into the woods to play. The adults laughed, thinking nothing of it, until a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. When they found her, she was cradling a human skull, her sharp teeth glinting as she laughed. 2 small horns had begun to grow from her golden curls, and her innocent blue eyes had turned black as coal. "Look, Mama," Lilith exclaimed, holding the skull toward Martha. "He said he wants to play with me forever." The skull belonged to a villager who had gone missing months prior. The crowd recoiled in horror, but Samuel stepped forward, grabbing the skull and throwing it into the woods. He tried to console his wife, but Martha had fallen to her knees, realizing the terrible truth. Their child was no gift. It was a curse the villagers demanded that Lilith be cast out, fearing her presence would bring doom to them all. But Martha and Samuel refused to abandon their daughter, choosing instead to live on the outskirts of the village in isolation. Over time, their once happy home became a prison of fear. Lilith's behavior grew more sinister. She spoke to shadows, her laughter echoing eerily through the empty halls of their home. Objects moved on their own, and the walls seemed to whisper at night. Martha and Samuel barely slept, their love for their child slowly eroding under the weight of terror. One night, Martha awoke to find Lilith standing at the foot of her bed, her black eyes gleaming in the darkness. "Mama," Lilith whispered, her voice soft but chilling. "They don't like me, but it's okay. I made them stop." The next morning, the villagers awoke to a horrifying sight. Their livestock were slaughtered, their blood painting the walls of every home. At the center of the village square, Lilith stood with her wide, toothy grin, a trail of bloody footprints leading back to her home. The villagers decided they could no longer tolerate her existence. That night, armed with torches and weapons, they marched to the family's home. Samuel begged for mercy, shielding his daughter from the angry mob. But Martha, now a shadow of her former self, stepped forward. "She's not a child," Martha said, tears streaming down her face. "She's a demon. Do what you must." Horrified by his wife's words, Samuel turned to Lilith, who clutched his hand tightly. "Papa," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you won't let them hurt me, will you?" Before he could respond, the villagers stormed the house. The walls shook as the crowd tore through the rooms, their shouts mingling with Lilith's laughter. Suddenly, the torches dimmed, and an unnatural darkness engulfed the home. One by one, the villagers screamed as they were dragged into the shadows by unseen hands. When the light returned, the house was empty. Samuel and Martha were gone, their bodies never found. The villagers who survived swore they saw Lilith walking into the woods, her tiny hand cradling her raven companion, and her other clutching the skull she loved so dearly. Black Hollow became a desolate ruin, avoided by all who knew the tale. But Lilith's presence did not fade. She grew stronger, her powers reaching far beyond the cursed village. Travelers who wandered too close to the forest reported hearing a child's laughter, followed by whispers that chilled them to the bone. One such traveler, a wandering scholar named Elias, ventured into the ruins of Black Hollow, determined to uncover the truth. As he explored the overgrown remains, he found a child's drawing etched into the walls of a crumbling home, a smiling girl holding hands with shadowy figures beneath a blood-red moon. That night, Elias awoke to the sound of laughter. His lantern flickered as a cold wind swept through the ruins. Turning, he saw her, Lilith, her black eyes glowing and her horns curving sharply from her golden curls. In her hands, she held the skull, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. "Do you want to play?" she asked, her voice sweet yet dripping with malice. Elias tried to run, but the shadows came alive, twisting and clawing at him. Lilith's laughter grew louder, echoing in his mind as the darkness consumed him. To this day, travelers are warned to stay far from Black Hollow. Those who ignore the warnings often vanish without a trace, their screams said to echo through the woods. On nights when the moon is full and red, some claim to see a small figure standing at the edge of the forest, her glowing black eyes watching, waiting. If you ever hear the laughter of a child when no one is near, beware. Lilith may be close, clutching her beloved skull and inviting you to join her eternal game. But remember, once you meet her gaze, there is no escape. For the devil's daughter never loses, and her playground is forever expanding. Story 2. The Laughter in the Dark Forest. Hidden in a remote corner of a desolate land, far from modern cities and lights, there was a small village nestled beside a dense forest. This village, named Greenwood, was surrounded by rugged mountains and an ancient forest that the locals called the Cursed Woods. The name came from an old legend about the forest, a shadowy place no one dared to confront. The elders of the village told stories of a man who once lived among them and became the embodiment of terror. He was a renowned healer, loved by the villagers for his dedication and skill. But a tragic event turned him into something no longer human. He became the Blood Laugher, a malevolent spirit roaming the forest, ready to bring death to anyone who dared enter his domain. The story began on a stormy night. A violent storm swept through the village, plunging the area into darkness as power lines fell. Inside the small houses, candles flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The sound of rain hitting the rooftops mixed with thunder, creating an ominous atmosphere. David, a young man known for his bravery and slight arrogance, was a prominent figure in the village. He often dismissed the tales of horror that the villagers shared. Just silly legends to scare kids, David would scoff whenever he heard stories about the Blood Laugher. That night, while drinking with his friends, David heard a daring challenge. One of his friends, Tom, said, "If you're so brave, why not go into the woods at midnight? Just bring back a branch from one of the ancient trees at the center, and I'll admit you're the bravest of us all." Fueled by pride, David accepted the challenge immediately. Little did he know, this decision would change his life forever. At the stroke of midnight, David stepped into the forest armed with a flashlight and a small knife. The air was so cold that it made him shiver, even under his thick jacket. The chirping of insects and the rustling of leaves created an unsettling melody. But David pressed on, his flashlight illuminating the path ahead. As he ventured deeper, the atmosphere became increasingly eerie. The sounds of the forest fell silent, replaced by a deathly stillness. The trees around him seemed taller, their bare branches reaching out like skeletal hands trying to grab him. David began to sense something was amiss, but his pride kept him from turning back. Suddenly, a laugh echoed through the forest. It was no ordinary laugh. It was raspy, deranged, and reverberated through the woods. David froze, his heart pounding. He shone his flashlight in all directions but saw nothing. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice trembling. The laughter came again, closer and clearer. It seemed to emanate from everywhere, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. Suddenly, his flashlight flickered and went out. Panic set in as David fumbled to turn it back on, but it was no use. In the darkness, he felt something watching him. A cold breath brushed against the back of his neck. David spun around, and that was when he saw it. It stood there, just a few feet away. Its glowing eyes pierced the darkness like two ghostly flames. Its face was pale and cracked, with a sinister grin exposing razor-sharp teeth. Its tattered clothing was stained with dried blood, and a foul stench emanated from it. It said nothing, only stood there laughing. The laughter was cold and haunting, paralyzing David with fear. He stumbled backward, tripping over a tree root and falling to the ground. The figure advanced slowly, each step deliberate and menacing. David scrambled to his feet, wielding his knife in desperation. But the knife was useless against it. The entity grabbed David's wrist with a grip so strong he thought his bones would snap. Leaning in close, it whispered in a guttural voice, "You shouldn't have come here." And then, everything went black. The next morning, the villagers found David's flashlight and knife lying on the forest path. Nearby, a message was scrawled in blood on a tree trunk. "The blood laugher has chosen." David was never seen again. The villagers believed he had become part of the forest, like those who had vanished before him. No one dared approach the cursed woods after that, and every night, the haunting laughter of the blood laugher echoed through the village, a chilling reminder that the darkness and its curse remained unbroken. 3 months later, a group of tourists stumbled upon Greenwood. They heard the legend of the cursed woods from the villagers but dismissed it as mere superstition. Among them was a paranormal researcher named Jack, fascinated by stories of the supernatural. Determined to uncover the truth, Jack led the group on an expedition into the forest. On the night of a full moon, the group ventured into the woods. At first, everything seemed normal. But as they delved deeper, the air grew oppressive. Eerie laughter began to echo around them, sending shivers down their spines. Reaching the forest's center, they discovered an old, decrepit cabin covered in moss and vines. Inside, they found torn journal pages detailing the anguish of the healer who had become the blood laugher. The entries revealed his descent into madness after losing his family and his soul being consumed by hatred. As they read, laughter erupted from behind them. Jack turned to see the glowing eyes of the blood laugher. One by one, his companions vanished into the darkness, dragged away amidst screams of terror. Jack was the last. Before the entity consumed him, he saw a bloody message appear on the cabin wall. "You can never escape." Greenwood is now abandoned, a ghost village no one dares to visit. The cursed woods have become a place of death, shrouded in darkness. But on moonless nights, the laughter of the bloodlaugher still echoes, a grim warning to those who dare trespass. They say if you hear laughter in the night, run as fast as you can. But sometimes, no matter how fast you run, death catches up to you. Story 3. The Queen of Eternal Silence. In a land long forgotten by time, shrouded in mist and shadow, there existed a kingdom cursed by its own vanity. At its heart stood a crumbling castle, surrounded by desolation, where no birds sang and no winds stirred. This kingdom was ruled by the Queen of Eternal Silence, a spectral monarch whose presence brought dread and despair. Centuries ago, the queen was said to be the most beautiful and powerful ruler of her time. Her kingdom thrived, but her heart was filled with pride and greed. She desired eternal beauty and dominion over death itself. Seeking immortality, she called upon a forbidden ritual involving ancient relics and the blood of her most loyal subjects. Despite warnings from her advisors and priests, the queen pressed forward, convinced that no price was too high. On the night of the ritual, the skies darkened, and the moon turned crimson. Draped in her finest robes and adorned with a crown encrusted with pearls and cursed gems, the queen made her offering. As the final incantation echoed through the halls of the castle, the room fell silent. For a moment, it seemed she had succeeded. But the magic was not what she had hoped. The gods, angered by her arrogance, cursed the queen. Her beauty faded, replaced by a skeletal visage. Her kingdom, once vibrant and alive, withered into a barren wasteland. Worst of all, her voice, the source of her commanding power, was stolen, leaving her to wander her halls in silence for eternity. The queen's curse extended beyond her mortal form. Anyone who dared enter the castle would find themselves ensnared in her domain. Travelers often reported hearing whispers in the dead of night, though no one could be seen. Others spoke of glimpsing a figure cloaked in tattered robes, a crown glinting in the faint light, her hollow eye sockets staring into their very souls. Over time, the castle became known as the Palace of Silence, a place where the living feared to tread. Superstition claimed that her crown was the source of her power and torment. Legend spoke of brave adventurers who sought the crown, believing it held unimaginable power. None ever returned. One fateful evening, a wanderer named Elias, a scholar obsessed with ancient curses, arrived at the edge of the cursed kingdom. Driven by curiosity and the promise of forbidden knowledge, Elias was determined to uncover the truth about the Silent Queen. Armed with nothing but his wits and a lantern, he ventured into the desolate land. The castle loomed in the distance, its spires piercing the ash-gray skies. As Elias crossed the threshold, a heavy silence fell upon him. The air was thick and cold, and every step echoed unnaturally loud. Shadows seemed to shift and writhe at the corners of his vision. Deep within the castle, Elias found a grand hall filled with decayed tapestries and shattered mirrors. At the center stood a throne of bone, and upon it sat the queen. Her skeletal frame was draped in dark, tattered silks, and her crown, intricately detailed and horrifyingly beautiful, rested atop her hollowed skull. Elias froze as her head slowly turned to face him. Her empty sockets seemed to see into the depths of his soul. The room filled with an unnatural, suffocating silence. Elias attempted to speak, his voice trembling. "Your Majesty, I seek the truth of your curse. I mean no harm." The queen rose from her throne, her movements slow and deliberate. As she approached, Elias noticed the faint glow emanating from her crown. She raised a skeletal hand, and for a brief moment, Elias felt a presence enter his mind. a vision overtook him. Flashes of the queen's past, her desperation for power, and the horrific ritual that led to her downfall. He saw her anguish as her kingdom crumbled, her people perished, and she was left alone in eternal silence. The crown, he realized, was both her punishment and the key to breaking the curse. But as the vision faded, Elias heard a voice. Not from the queen, but from within his own mind. It was dark, twisted, and alluring. "Take the crown," it whispered. "With it, you can command death itself." Elias was torn. He could see the torment in the queen's hollow eyes, the centuries of regret and suffering. Yet the crown's power called to him, promising answers to the mysteries of life and death. Slowly, he reached out toward the crown. The queen's skeletal hand shot up, gripping his wrist with unnatural strength. Her head shook slowly, a silent plea. Her empty socket seemed to weep, though no tears fell. Elias hesitated, but the voice grew louder, more insistent. "Do it. Free her and claim the power." In a moment of weakness, Elias removed the crown from her head. The queen let out a soundless scream, her body collapsing into a heap of dust. The silence in the castle grew heavier, more oppressive. As Elias held the crown, he felt a cold, dark energy surge through him. At first, Elias felt triumphant. The crown whispered secrets of the universe, filling his mind with forbidden knowledge. But as the days passed, he began to change. His voice faded, his flesh withered, and his body twisted into the same skeletal form as the queen. The crown's curse had not been broken. It had merely been passed on. The kingdom remained desolate, but now it had a new ruler. Elias, now the king of eternal silence, wandered the halls of the castle, his mind tormented by the whispers of the crown. He was trapped in the same cycle of despair, a warning to all who sought power without understanding its cost. Years later, rumors of the cursed castle reached the ears of another adventurer. Drawn by the promise of power, they ventured into the desolate land, unaware of the fate that awaited them. The castle's windows glowed faintly under the moonlight, and the haunting whispers of both the queen and the new king echoed through the halls. It is said that those who enter the castle can hear the lament of the cursed rulers, their silent cries filling the void. But none who venture into the Palace of Silence ever return, and on quiet nights, the faint glimmer of the crown can still be seen, a beacon of temptation and doom, waiting for its next victim. Story 4. The Keeper of the Skull Flame. In a realm where the boundaries between life and death blur, legends speak of an enigmatic figure known only as the Keeper of the Skull Flame. It is said she exists in the liminal space between worlds, neither fully alive nor entirely dead. She's a guardian of forgotten souls, holding the power to grant eternal life, or to snuff it out like a candle's flame. Long ago, in a village on the edge of a dense and cursed forest, the people lived in perpetual fear of the dark. They whispered about a mysterious woman cloaked in black, her face painted like a skull. She would appear in the dead of night, cradling a human skull with a single flame flickering atop it. They claimed that if the flame burned brightly, the village would prosper. But if the flame dimmed, it was an omen of death. The villagers believed this flame was no ordinary light. It was the essence of a soul trapped within the skull, fueling the keeper's power. Some said the skull once belonged to a great necromancer who tried to cheat death, only to be defeated and enslaved by the keeper herself. One fateful year, the village was struck by an unrelenting plague. Crops withered, children fell ill, and the rivers ran dry. In their desperation, the villagers turned to the forest, praying for the keeper to appear. As the moon reached its zenith, she emerged from the shadows, her presence chilling the air. "Who dares summon me?" Her voice echoed, deep and resonant, as though it came from the very ground. A young woman named Eleanor, desperate to save her ailing child, stepped forward. "Please, Keeper," she begged, her voice trembling. "Save my son. I will give you anything." The Keeper tilted her head, her dark, hollow eyes glinting with an otherworldly light. She extended her hands, holding the skull flame toward Eleanor. "You would trade your soul for his?" she asked. Eleanor nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I would." The Keeper let out a low, hollow laugh. "Very well, but know this: no gift from the dead is ever free." With a flick of her fingers, the flame atop the skull grew brighter. Eleanor's son was healed, his fever breaking instantly. But Eleanor herself collapsed, her soul now bound to the Keeper's collection. The villagers watched in horror as Eleanor's body turned cold and pale, her eyes wide with terror. Years passed, and the village recovered from the plague. But the Keeper's visits became more frequent. Each time she demanded a soul to keep her flame alive. Those who resisted would find their loved ones falling ill or their homes consumed by mysterious fires. The villagers came to understand that the flame was both a blessing and a curse, a delicate balance they could not escape. One stormy night, a rebellious blacksmith named Arthur decided he had had enough. He gathered a small band of villagers, armed with torches and pitchforks, to confront the Keeper in her forest lair. They followed the flickering glow of her skull flame deep into the woods, their courage fueled by desperation. When they found her, she was standing before a massive tree twisted with blackened roots. The skull in her hands burned brighter than ever, its flame casting eerie shadows on the surrounding trees. "You dare defy me?" the Keeper said, her voice dripping with amusement. Arthur stepped forward, his hammer raised. "We will no longer be your slaves. Release us from this curse." The Keeper tilted her head, and for the first time, the villagers saw a flicker of something like pity in her dark eyes. "You cannot destroy what you do not understand," she said. "But you are welcome to try." Arthur swung his hammer at the skull, hoping to extinguish the flame. But the moment his weapon struck, an ear-piercing scream erupted from the skull. The flame exploded outward, engulfing Arthur and his band. When the light faded, all that remained were charred bones and ashes. The Keeper stood untouched, her skeletal face calm. She looked at the remaining villagers and said, "The flame feeds on defiance. Remember this." The villagers' fear of the Keeper grew, but so did their hatred. Many years later, a wandering priest named Father Gregory arrived in the village. He was said to be a holy man, carrying relics blessed by saints. Gregory listened to the villagers' plight and vowed to confront the Keeper, armed with divine protection. Under the light of a full moon, Gregory ventured into the cursed forest. The air grew colder with each step, and the shadows seemed to come alive. Eventually, he found the Keeper, her figure illuminated by the skull's unholy flame. "You have taken enough souls," Gregory declared, holding a silver cross aloft. "Your reign of terror ends here." The Keeper laughed, a hollow, echoing sound. "You are brave, priest, but misguided. The flame cannot be extinguished by faith alone." Gregory ignored her, chanting prayers as he approached. The flame atop the skull flickered and dimmed, as though struggling against his words. For a moment, it seemed he might succeed. But the Keeper whispered something under her breath, and the flame roared back to life. It leapt from the skull, enveloping Gregory. His screams echoed through the forest as the fire consumed him, leaving nothing but ash. The Keeper's flame burned brighter than ever, its power renewed. The villagers never saw Father Gregory again. Over time, They realized the keeper was not merely a cursed being, but a force of nature, a balance between life and death. Her skull flame was not a punishment, but a necessary burden. Without it, the boundary between the living and the dead would collapse. One by one, the villagers abandoned their homes, unable to bear the weight of her presence. The village became a ghost town, overgrown and forgotten. But the keeper remained, her flame an eternal beacon in the darkness. To this day, travelers who wander too close to the forest speak of a woman cloaked in black, her skeletal face lit by a flickering flame. Some say she offers bargains, while others claim she takes what she desires without warning. On moonless nights, if you see a light in the distance, beware. For it may not be a guide, but the keeper herself, watching, waiting to claim another soul for her eternal flame. Story 5. The Bride of Ashen Vales. In a desolate corner of the world, where sunlight barely touched the earth and shadows stretched long into the night, there was a village haunted by a single terrifying legend, the Bride of Ashen Vales. They said she roamed the barren fields at dusk, her hollow eyes glowing with an unearthly light, searching for the souls of the living to join her eternal wedding procession. Long ago, the village of Morning Hollow celebrated the wedding of Lady Eleanor, the daughter of the wealthiest family in the region. She was known for her beauty, her porcelain skin, and her devotion to her fiancé, Lord Alaric. The wedding was to be a grand affair, uniting two powerful houses. But as the ceremony began, a storm rolled in, blackening the sky and filling the air with an ominous chill. Before Eleanor could exchange her vows, tragedy struck. A figure cloaked in tattered robes burst into the chapel, wielding a dagger blackened with poison. It was a scorned lover of Eleanor's, a man she had once courted but rejected. Blinded by rage and jealousy, he lunged at her, driving the dagger deep into her heart before the horrified eyes of her guests. As Eleanor fell to the cold stone floor, her veil soaked in blood, the killer was subdued and dragged away. But no justice could bring solace to the grieving Lord Alaric. Overcome with despair, he took his own life that same night, hanging himself in the chapel where he had hoped to marry the love of his life. The villagers buried Eleanor in her wedding gown, her veil covering her lifeless face. But whispers of a curse began almost immediately. At the stroke of midnight on the night of her burial, strange wails were heard emanating from her grave. Days later, her tomb was found empty, the earth clawed open from the inside. People began seeing her ghostly figure wandering the countryside, her gown torn and her veil tattered, glowing eyes peering out from her skeletal visage. She became known as the Bride of Ashen Vales, a restless spirit bound to the mortal world by her unfulfilled vows. It was said that she sought to claim the souls of those who wandered too far from the village after dark, dragging them into a procession of the damned. Her victims would be cursed to wander alongside her, their faces obscured by veils of ash, forever part of her unholy wedding march. Decades passed, and the villagers learned to avoid the fields at dusk. But one fateful evening, a young man named Thomas, emboldened by drink and a dare from his friends, ventured into the cursed fields. Armed with nothing but a lantern, he stumbled through the darkened landscape, laughing off the warnings of elders. The laughter died in his throat when he saw her. She stood beneath a twisted, dead tree, her tattered veil swaying in the windless air. Her eyes glowed like embers, fixed on Thomas with an intensity that froze him in place. Her skeletal grin widened as she extended a bony hand toward him. "Will you take my hand, dear groom?" Her voice was a hollow whisper, like the rustling of dry leaves. Thomas screamed and fled, dropping his lantern as he ran. But no matter how far or fast he went, The glowing eyes of the bride appeared in the darkness, always ahead of him. The villagers found his lifeless body the next morning, his face pale and his hands clutching a veil made of ash. The sightings of the bride grew more frequent, and with each appearance, the fields around Morning Hollow became more barren. Crops withered, livestock vanished, and the once thriving village began to crumble under the weight of her curse. Those who dared to confront her never returned, their faces joining the growing crowd of veiled specters seen following her through the fields. One night, a wandering priest named Father Dorian arrived in Morning Hollow. He claimed to have knowledge of rituals that could banish restless spirits, and the desperate villagers begged him to rid them of the bride's curse. Armed with holy relics, Father Dorian ventured into the fields alone, determined to confront the bride of Ashen Veils. Father Dorian found her beneath the same twisted tree where Thomas had met his end. Her skeletal frame was cloaked in decayed lace, her veil fluttering despite the still air. As he began his incantations, she let out a blood-curdling scream that shattered the stillness of the night. The ground trembled, and the veiled spirits of her victims emerged from the shadows, circling the priest like a macabre wedding party. "Do you think you can send me back?" she hissed, her voice dripping with malice. "I am bound to this world by love betrayed and vows unspoken. Until the day a groom takes my hand and speaks my vows, I will not leave." The priest faltered, his courage waning as the bride and her procession closed in. He tried to complete the ritual, but the spirits tore the relics from his hands, silencing his prayers. The villagers awoke the next morning to find his body beneath the twisted tree, his face obscured by a veil of ash. Years passed, and the village was abandoned, left to decay under the weight of the curse. Yet the legend of the bride of Ashen Veils continued to draw the curious and the desperate. One such man was Victor, a historian obsessed with uncovering the truth behind the bride's tale. He believed that if he could reenact her wedding ceremony, he might break the curse and free her soul. Victor prepared meticulously, studying old texts and gathering artifacts from the ruins of Morning Hollow. On the anniversary of her death, he ventured into the cursed fields, dressed in a groom's attire and carrying a ring forged from silver and obsidian. He called out to her beneath the twisted tree, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his heart. "Lady Eleanor," he said, "I have come to complete your vows. Take my hand and let this torment end." The bride appeared, her glowing eyes narrowing as she regarded him. For a moment, the procession of veiled spirits halted, their hollow faces turned toward Victor in silence. Slowly, she extended her bony hand, her skeletal grin widening. "Do you vow to love me, in death as in life?" she whispered. Victor hesitated but nodded. "I do." As he slid the ring onto her finger, the flame in her eyes flared, engulfing them both in a blinding light. The ground shook, and the veiled spirits let out a collective wail as they dissolved into ash. For a brief moment, it seemed the curse had been lifted. When the light faded, the fields were silent. Victor was gone, but the bride remained, her veil restored, and her skeletal frame draped in pristine lace. Her glowing eyes burned brighter than ever as she turned and began to walk, her wedding march echoing through the night. The villagers who returned years later spoke of a new figure in her procession. A man dressed as a groom, his face obscured by a veil of ash. The curse had not been broken. It had merely evolved. The bride no longer sought a single soul, but a new wedding party to accompany her forever. Now, on moonless nights, the sound of faint wedding bells can be heard drifting through the fields. And if you are unlucky enough to follow them, you may find yourself drawn into the procession, your face veiled in ash, your soul bound to the bride of Ashen Veils for all eternity. Story 6. The Reaper's Covenant. In a realm beyond mortal comprehension, where the living dare not tread and the dead find no rest, there exists a myth about two skeletal figures cloaked in eternal mystery. Known as the bride and groom of death, they are said to rule over the threshold between life and the afterlife, bound together by a pact forged in eternity and drenched in sorrow. Long ago, there was a kingdom ruled by Queen Isolde and her husband, King Thane. They were beloved by their people for their wisdom and fairness, but their love for each other outshone all else. They were inseparable, their bond so strong that even the heavens seemed to bless their union. But their happiness became the target of envy and malice. A neighboring kingdom, jealous of their prosperity, waged war against them. The conflict was brutal, and despite their efforts, the castle walls were breached. On the final night of the siege, Queen Isolde and King Thane were cornered in the throne room. Refusing to surrender and unwilling to live apart in defeat, they drank from a poisoned chalice, choosing to die together rather than fall into the hands of their enemies. But the gods, moved by their unwavering devotion, offered them a chance at immortality, though not as rulers of the living. Instead, they would become guardians of death, forever guiding souls to the afterlife. Bound to this role, they were transformed into spectral figures. Isolde, the pale bride, draped in ghostly white, and Thane, the dark groom, cloaked in shadows. Each of the Reapers carried a sacred artifact symbolizing their role. Isolde wielded a silver scythe adorned with the skull of an ancient seer, which had the power to sever the bonds between a soul and its mortal body. Thane carried a lantern that burned with the eternal flame of the afterlife, guiding lost souls through the darkness to their final rest. Together, they traversed the mortal plane, appearing at the moments of great tragedy, plagues, and wars. It was said that if you saw the bride and groom of death, your time in the mortal realm was at an end. Centuries passed, and the legend of the Reapers became feared across all lands. People told tales of their eerie beauty, how Isolde's hollow gaze seemed to pierce through time, and how Thane's silent presence could freeze even the bravest hearts. But beneath their cold exterior, they carried a heavy burden. Though they were bound together for eternity, they could never truly touch, their skeletal hands forever unable to feel the warmth they once shared as mortals. It was said that once every 100 years, a mortal would be granted the chance to alter their fate. This was the Whispering Prophecy, a cryptic tale that promised freedom to anyone brave enough to confront the Reapers and uncover the truth behind their curse. One such mortal was Elias, a grieving scholar who had lost his wife to a sudden illness. Obsessed with the idea of reuniting with her, he sought out the bride and groom of death, hoping to bargain for her soul. Guided by fragments of the Whispering Prophecy, Elias ventured into the Shadow Vale, a desolate wasteland said to be the gateway to their realm. On the 7th night of his journey, beneath a moon shrouded in mist, he found them. Isolde stood tall, her scythe glinting faintly in the dim light, while Thane's lantern cast flickering shadows across the barren ground. Their hollow eyes fixed on Elias as he approached, trembling but determined. "What do you seek, mortal?" Isolde's voice echoed cold and melodic, as though carried by the wind itself. "I seek to reclaim my wife's soul," Elias said, his voice faltering under their unearthly gaze. "I will do whatever it takes." Thane tilted his head, his silence more menacing than any word. Finally, Isolde spoke again. "The living cannot undo death, but you may gamble with fate if you dare. If you win, your wife's soul will be returned. If you lose, you will join our eternal covenant." Elias hesitated but nodded. "What must I do?" The bride raised her scythe, drawing a circle in the earth. The ground within the circle shimmered, revealing the faces of countless souls trapped in torment. "Find your wife's soul among the lost," Isolde instructed. But beware, the souls you disturb may not let you leave. Elias stepped into the circle, his heart pounding. Shadows rose around him, whispering his name, clawing at his clothes. He searched desperately, calling out for his wife, but the faces blurred together, their voices a cacophony of sorrow. Finally, he saw her, a faint figure at the edge of the circle, her eyes wide with fear. Elias reached out, but as their hands nearly touched, the ground erupted with shadowy tendrils pulling him back. "No!" Elias screamed, struggling against the darkness. Isolde and Thane watched in silence as the tendrils dragged him into the abyss. His screams faded, replaced by the mournful whispers of the other souls. When the circle closed, Isolde turned to Thane. "Another loss to the Covenant," she said, her voice tinged with regret. Thane's lantern flickered, and he reached out, his skeletal fingers brushing against hers. Though they could never truly touch, it was a silent reminder of the love that bound them, and the curse that kept them apart. As Elias's soul joined the countless others trapped in the Shadow Veil, he realized the terrible truth. The whispering prophecy was not a chance at redemption, but a trap designed to bind more souls to the Reaper's service. Each mortal who dared to gamble became part of their eternal procession, fueling their power and deepening their curse. The bride and groom of death continue their solemn march, their lanterns casting eerie light across the mortal plane. Their burden grows heavier with each passing century, their love enduring but forever out of reach. And the Shadow Veil expands, swallowing all who dare to challenge the inevitability of death. If you ever find yourself at the edge of the Shadow Veil, beware the faint glow of a lantern and the glint of a silver scythe. For they are not there to guide you. They are there to claim you. Story 7. The Mistress of the Black Raven. In the shadowed corners of a forgotten land, there is a tale whispered only in hushed tones. The story of the Mistress of the Black Raven, a woman who commands the secrets of death and the skies. They say she is neither mortal nor fully of this world, but a being born from vengeance and bound to a fate as dark as her raven companion. Long ago, in the remote village of Hollowmere, a young woman named Seraphina lived on the edge of the forest. She was known for her unmatched beauty, her ebony black hair, and the peculiar raven that always perched on her shoulder. The villagers kept their distance from her, muttering rumors of witchcraft and curses. Despite the whispers, Seraphina was kind-hearted, living a quiet life. But her tranquility was shattered when the Lord of the land, a cruel and greedy man named Lord Harrow, took notice of her. Harrow demanded that Seraphina marry him, claiming her beauty belonged to him. When she refused, he unleashed his wrath upon her, accusing her of witchcraft. He had her dragged to the center of the village, where she was tied to a stake. Before the flames could consume her, Seraphina called out to the raven that had been her only companion. The bird circled above, its caws growing louder and more frenzied. As the fire rose, Seraphina whispered a curse. "You shall not silence me," she vowed. "I will rise again, and I will make the skies my voice." When the flames died down, her body was gone, and the raven flew away into the dark woods, its eyes glowing like embers. Months after Seraphina's death, strange things began happening in Hollowmere. Crops withered overnight, livestock disappeared, and villagers reported hearing the beating of wings in the darkness. Some claimed to see a pale hand, adorned with blackened claws, reaching out from the shadows. Others spoke of the raven, now larger and more fearsome, watching them with unblinking, burning eyes. One night, the village woke to find Lord Harrow's manor engulfed in black feathers. His servants were missing, and the man himself was found dead in his chambers, his body clawed and his eyes missing. Clutched in his lifeless hand was a black feather, slick with blood. From that night onward, Seraphina became known as the mistress of the Black Raven, a vengeful specter who haunted the skies and punished those who committed injustices. The raven itself was said to be no ordinary bird. It was a piece of Seraphina's soul, a harbinger of her will. Wherever the raven went, death followed. But it was also a messenger, seeking those who were desperate enough to strike a bargain. If you found yourself at the edge of despair, you could summon the mistress by offering blood and calling her name. One such seeker was Amelia, a widow whose family had been slaughtered by raiders. Consumed by grief, she entered the cursed woods one moonless night, a dagger in her hand. She cut her palm and whispered into the darkness, "Mistress of the Black Raven, I call upon you." The raven appeared first, landing silently before her. Its eyes burned with an unnatural glow. Then, from the shadows, a hand emerged, long and pale, with black talons. Seraphina stepped into the moonlight, her face hidden beneath a veil of raven feathers, her fingers adorned with dark, intricate rings. "What is it you seek?" Seraphina asked, her voice cold and melodic. "Vengeance," Amelia whispered. "I want vengeance for my family." Seraphina smiled, though her teeth gleamed unnaturally sharp. "Vengeance comes with a price," she said. "Your soul will belong to me." Without hesitation, Amelia agreed. Seraphina raised her hand, and the raven flew to her shoulder. With a wave of her taloned fingers, the wind howled, and the forest seemed to come alive. That night, the raiders met their end, torn apart by shadows and talons. But Amelia was never seen again. The villagers claimed they saw a new figure in the sky. Another raven, its eyes glowing with the same fiery light as Seraphina's. Over the years, the mistress's flock grew. Each soul she claimed became another raven, bound to her eternal service. The skies above Hollowmere darkened with their numbers, and the village became a ghost town, abandoned by all but the bravest wanderers. One such wanderer was Elias, a scholar obsessed with the occult. He believed the mistress could be defeated by severing her bond with the raven, the source of her power. Armed with a ritual dagger and forbidden texts, Elias ventured into the cursed woods on the night of the blood moon. He found her standing in a clearing, the raven perched on her shoulder. The air grew cold as she turned to face him, her glowing eyes narrowing. "You seek to end me?" she asked, her voice laced with amusement. Elias raised the dagger. "Your reign ends tonight," he declared. The mistress laughed, a sound that sent shivers down his spine. "You cannot destroy what you do not understand," she said, "but you may try." As Elias lunged at the raven, the bird took flight, its caws echoing through the night. Seraphina raised her hands, and the shadows themselves seemed to come alive, clawing at Elias. He managed to strike the raven, severing one of its wings, but as its blood hit the ground, the clearing erupted in chaos. The wounded raven let out a deafening cry, and Seraphina fell to her knees, her form flickering like a dying flame. For a moment, it seemed Elias had succeeded. But as he approached her, dagger raised, the raven's blood pooled at his feet and began to writhe. From the blood rose a new figure, a colossal raven-shaped shadow that towered over the clearing. It stared down at Elias with burning eyes, its voice echoing in his mind. "You have freed me from my chains," it said. "Now you shall take her place." Before Elias could react, the shadow engulfed him. His screams were lost in the howling wind as his body twisted and contorted. becoming something inhuman. When the storm passed, Seraphina stood once more, her strength restored. But beside her was a new figure, a man with raven wings and eyes that glowed with the same fiery light. "Welcome to the flock," she said, her skeletal grin widening. The mistress of the Black Raven now roams not alone, but with her new consort, a grim figure known as the Raven King. Together, they command an ever-growing flock of souls, their shadows darkening the skies wherever they go. The cursed woods have spread, consuming neighboring villages, and the sound of wings fills the air. If you see a raven staring at you, beware, for it may not be just a bird. It may be the mistress or her king, watching, waiting to add you to their endless procession of the damned. Story 8. The Skull of the Storm. In the forgotten ruins of a once mighty kingdom, there lies a cursed city shrouded in eternal storm clouds. The lightning that streaks across the sky often illuminates a horrifying sight. A massive, skeletal visage etched in the churning storm above. Locals call it the Skull of the Storm, a harbinger of doom that appears whenever the greed and sins of humanity reach their peak. Centuries ago, Caltheron was the most prosperous city in the known world. Its towering spires gleamed under the sun, its streets bustled with life, and its wealth was unmatched. The king of Caltheron, Magnus the Eternal, was a man consumed by his lust for power and immortality. He feared death more than anything, and his obsession drove him to commit unspeakable acts. Magnus sought the wisdom of forbidden texts and summoned sorcerers from distant lands to aid him. Eventually, a mysterious figure cloaked in shadow came to the king. The figure promised Magnus eternal life and dominion over the heavens in exchange for a single act, a ritual that required the blood of Caltheron's purest souls. Blinded by his ambition, Magnus agreed. That very night, the figure instructed him to sacrifice 100 innocent lives at the heart of the city. As the ritual reached its crescendo, the skies above Caltheron blackened, and a furious storm erupted. The winds howled with the anguished screams of the sacrificed, and lightning struck the city's tallest spire, shattering it to pieces. From the storm emerged the skull, a manifestation of the souls Magnus had betrayed. Its hollow eyes glowed with the fire of eternal rage, and its massive jaw opened, releasing a deafening roar that shook the earth. One by one, the people of Caltheron fell to their knees, their bodies consumed by the storm, leaving only shadows burned into the walls. Magnus's ritual had failed. Instead of gaining eternal life, he had unleashed a curse upon the city. The Skull of the Storm declared that Caltheron would remain shrouded in darkness, its ruins a graveyard of greed and betrayal. Magnus himself was bound to the city as an immortal wraith, doomed to wander the ruins and hear the whispers of the souls he had sacrificed. The curse ensured that no life could thrive in Caltheron. Any who dared to enter the city would face the wrath of the storm, their bodies and souls devoured by the skull. The lightning that struck the ruins burned with an unnatural fire, leaving nothing but ash. Over the centuries, Caltheron became a legend, a warning to those who sought power at any cost. But greed is a persistent force. In a nearby kingdom, a warlord named Aldrich heard of the treasures that still lay within the ruins. Driven by his lust for wealth, he gathered an army and marched toward Caltheron. As Aldrich and his soldiers approached the ruins, the skies darkened, and the first rumble of thunder echoed across the plains. The villagers they passed begged them to turn back, but Aldrich dismissed their warnings as the superstitions of fools. When the army reached the city gates, a chilling silence fell over the land. The storm clouds above twisted and churned, forming the massive skull once more. Its eyes flared with fire, and its voice boomed across the ruins. A single bolt of lightning struck the ground before Aldrich, splitting the earth and releasing a torrent of shadowy figures, wraiths of Caltheron's dead. The soldiers fought valiantly, but their weapons were useless against the spirits. One by one, they fell, their screams drowned out by the roar of the storm. Aldrich himself stood defiant, his sword raised against the skull. But as he charged, the storm's maw opened, unleashing a torrent of wind and fire that consumed him. When the storm subsided, nothing remained of Aldrich or his army but scorched armor and ash. To this day, the ruins of Caltheron remain untouched, a monument to the consequences of unchecked ambition. Travelers report seeing the skull in the storm from miles away, its hollow eyes glowing with eternal rage. Some say they hear whispers in the wind, faint voices calling for help, or the vengeful laughter of King Magnus, forever trapped in his own folly. And on stormy nights, when the winds howl and the lightning strikes, the skull's roar can be heard across the land, a grim reminder of the price of greed. Those who dare to approach Caltheron's gates are never seen again, their fates sealed by the wrath of the storm. Centuries after Aldrich's fall, a wanderer named Elise appeared on the edge of the cursed lands. She was not like the others who came seeking treasure. Elise carried an ancient text, a relic passed down through her family, which spoke of a way to lift the curse of Caltheron. According to the text, one pure soul could offer itself willingly to the storm, cleansing the sins that birthed it. Elise's heart was heavy with guilt. Her ancestors had been among those who enabled King Magnus's tyranny, their wealth built on the suffering of the innocent sacrificed. Determined to atone, she ventured into the storm. As Elise entered the ruins, the storm awakened. The skull of the storm loomed above, its hollow eyes burning with fury. Another fool seeks redemption. You will find only death. Elise knelt before the skull, holding the text aloft. "I do not come to defy you," she said, her voice steady despite the thunderous wind. "I come to offer myself in penance." The skull's jaw opened, releasing a deafening roar that shook the ground. But as Elise began to recite the ancient words, a strange stillness fell over the ruins. The wraiths of Caltheron emerged, their forms less menacing now, their hollow eyes fixed on her. "One pure soul," the skull rumbled. "Will you carry the weight of the damned?" "I will," Elise whispered. A bolt of lightning struck her, but instead of pain, she felt a searing warmth. Her body dissolved into light, and the storm began to change. The skull's fiery eyes dimmed, and the clouds began to part, revealing a sky that had not been seen in centuries. But the curse was not truly broken. The light that had consumed Elise faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The ruins of Caltheron remained, but the skull was gone. In its place, a new figure stood. Elise, her body now a skeletal form, her eyes glowing faintly with the same fiery light that had once burned in the skull. She raised her hands, and the wraiths of Caltheron bowed before her. "The curse is mine now," she said, her voice echoing with 1,000 whispers. "I will guard this place for all eternity." And so, the cycle continued. Caltheron remained a place of despair, its curse passed to a new guardian. The skull of the storm may have vanished, but its legacy lived on, haunting the skies and the hearts of those who dared to dream of power. If you see a figure standing in the ruins, do not approach. For Elise watches now, her hollow gaze fixed on the horizon, waiting for the next soul to fall victim to Caltheron's endless wrath. Story 9. The Lady of Black Hollow. In the heart of a desolate village forgotten by time, where the wind howls like a mourning choir and the shadows seem to breathe, there exists a legend of the Lady of Black Hollow. She is a spectral figure, clad in a tattered black gown that seems to merge with the darkness itself. Her skeletal form wanders the ruins of a long-abandoned manor, her hollow gaze fixed on the clock tower that looms above the cursed village. Centuries ago, Black Hollow was a prosperous village, its heart a grand manor owned by Lady Evelyn Blackthorn. She was a noblewoman of unmatched beauty, known for her cold demeanor and her obsessive quest for power. Lady Evelyn believed she could conquer time itself and sought the secrets of immortality. Deep in the manor's catacombs, she hosted secret rituals, sacrificing animals and later humans in her pursuit of forbidden knowledge. She summoned spirits and dealt with shadowy entities, growing more desperate with each passing year. The villagers whispered of strange cries echoing from the manor at night, and lights flickering from the clock tower even when no one was there. One fateful evening, Evelyn conducted her final ritual. It was said that she bargained with a being known only as the Shadowed One, offering her soul in exchange for immortality. But the deal came with a cruel twist. Evelyn's body was stripped of its flesh, leaving her as a skeletal wraith bound to the ruins of her manor, cursed to roam Black Hollow for all eternity. Her immortality became her torment, and the manor's clock tower stopped at the exact moment of the ritual, its hands frozen at midnight. After Evelyn's transformation, the village began to decay. Crops withered, the rivers dried up, and the villagers either fled or succumbed to madness. Those who dared to remain were plagued by nightmares of skeletal hands reaching out from the darkness and whispers that promised eternal life if they stayed. The Lady of Black Hollow became a grim guardian of the ruins, her hollow eyes glowing faintly as she wandered the streets. Travelers who strayed too close to Black Hollow reported eerie phenomena: bats circling the manor even during the day, shadows moving independently of the light, and the tolling of the frozen clock tower at midnight. Though the clock had not worked in centuries, one cold autumn night, a historian named Marcus ventured into Black Hollow. He had heard the legends of Lady Evelyn and sought the truth behind her curse. Armed with lanterns and ancient texts, Marcus entered the village, his footsteps echoing on the cracked cobblestones. The air grew colder as he approached the manor, the shadows deepening around him. Inside the manor, Marcus found decayed furniture, shattered mirrors, and walls scrawled with arcane symbols. At the center of the grand hall stood an ornate grandfather clock, its hands frozen at midnight. As Marcus inspected the clock, he felt a chill crawl down his spine. "Why have you come here?" a voice whispered, cold and hollow. Marcus turned to see her, the Lady of Black Hollow. Her skeletal figure seemed to glide across the floor, her gown trailing behind her like a pool of shadows. Her empty eye sockets burned with a faint, otherworldly light. "I seek the truth," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "Is it true that you defied death?" The lady tilted her head, her jaw twisting into a ghastly grin. "The truth is not what you seek. You seek power like all who come here. You will pay the same price." As Marcus tried to explain himself, the clock tower began to toll, its chimes echoing through the manor. The ground beneath him cracked, and shadowy tendrils rose from the floor, wrapping around his legs. He struggled, but the more he fought, the tighter the shadows gripped him. The lady raised her bony hand, and the shadows dragged Marcus toward the grandfather clock. "You wished to understand my curse," she said. "Now you shall share it." With a final toll of the clock, Marcus was pulled into its frozen face, his screams swallowed by the chimes. The clock's hands moved for the first time in centuries, ticking forward 1 minute before stopping again. The Lady of Black Hollow returned to her endless vigil, her hollow gaze fixed on the clock tower. It is said that Marcus's face now appears in the clock's glass, his mouth open in a silent scream. The clock ticks forward by 1 minute for every soul the lady claims. And when it strikes midnight again, her curse will consume the world. As the years passed, the clock began to tick more frequently. Each new victim added to its momentum, and the whispers of Black Hollow grew louder. Stories spread of entire groups of travelers disappearing into the village, their screams echoing through the night as the clock crept ever closer to midnight. One stormy evening, a young woman named Clara, a descendant of one of Evelyn's original victims, entered Black Hollow with a different purpose. She carried an ancient amulet said to be forged by the Shadowed One's rival, a being of light and balance. Clara believed the amulet could stop the clock and end the lady's reign of terror. As Clara entered the manor, the air crackled with energy. The lady appeared, her skeletal form more imposing than ever. "You are brave to come here, child," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "But bravery will not save you." Clara held up the amulet, its light piercing through the shadows. For the first time, the lady recoiled, her bony hands shielding her face. The clock began to toll, its chimes louder and more frantic than ever. "You cannot stop what has already begun," the lady hissed. "The clock will strike, and the world will be mine." As the clock's hands moved closer to midnight, Clara placed the amulet on the grandfather clock. The light erupted, illuminating the entire manor. The wraiths of Black Hollow's victims appeared, their forms flickering like dying flames. "You can be free," Clara said, her voice shaking. "Help me end this." The wraiths turned to the lady, their hollow eyes filled with sorrow. They surged forward, their hands grasping at her shadowy form. The lady let out an unearthly scream as the clock's final chime echoed through the manor. The light faded, and the clock tower collapsed, its ruins swallowed by the earth. Clara emerged from the rubble, the amulet shattered in her hands. But as she looked back at the ruins, she saw a faint glow in the distance, a single ember burning in the darkness. Though the clock was destroyed, the curse was not fully broken. The Lady of Black Hollow's skeletal form now wanders the lands, her shadow stretching across the horizon. She no longer waits in her manor, but hunts those who bear even a trace of greed or ambition, adding their souls to her collection. On nights when the wind howls and the moon hides behind storm clouds, travelers claim to see her silhouette in the distance. If you hear the faint tolling of a clock when no clock is near, beware, for the Lady of Black Hollow is never far, and her curse is eternal. Story 10, The Eternal Waltz. In the depths of a long-forgotten forest, hidden beneath layers of mist and shadow, lies an ancient ballroom known as the Veiled Pavilion. This cursed hall is said to host a ghostly celebration that never ends, where two skeletal figures, dressed as a bride and groom, waltz under the pale glow of the moon. Known only as the Eternal Dancers, they are the guardians of a tragic love story that defied even death. Centuries ago, Isabella Devereux was the daughter of a wealthy nobleman, and Victor Grayson was a humble violinist who played at her family's grand estates. Despite their stark differences in status, they fell deeply in love. Their secret meetings were filled with promises of a life together, far from the confines of wealth and expectation. However, when Isabella's father discovered their affair, he forbade her from seeing Victor. Determined to keep them apart, he arranged for Isabella to marry a duke, a man of power and influence. On the eve of her wedding, Isabella fled into the forest, desperate to find Victor and escape her fate. Victor, too, had heard of Isabella's impending marriage. Consumed by heartbreak, he played a haunting melody on his violin in the forest, his music calling out to her. Their reunion was brief but filled with hope. They vowed to run away together. Yet, as fate would have it, Isabella's father had sent his men to track her down. When they found the couple, tragedy struck. Victor was killed before her eyes, and in her grief, Isabella took her own life, vowing that their love would endure beyond death. As Isabella's blood mingled with Victor's, the ground beneath them trembled, and an eerie mist enveloped the forest. Legend says that their love was so powerful it awakened an ancient spirit of the woods, who cursed the site to become an eternal ballroom. From that day forward, the lovers rose each night as skeletal figures, bound to dance together under the light of the moon, while the forest echoed with Victor's haunting melody. The veiled pavilion, a crumbling remnant of a grand estate, became the center of this cursed waltz. Within its walls, the spirits of those who had perished in tragic love stories joined the couple, forming an eternal audience for the ghostly celebration. The violin's mournful tune could be heard by travelers who dared to wander too close. Over the centuries, the veiled pavilion became a beacon for lost souls and those who sought forbidden knowledge. It was said that if you entered the ballroom and joined the dance, the couple would grant you a single wish. However, the price was steep. If you faltered during the waltz or disrupted the music, you would be trapped in the ballroom forever, your soul becoming part of the cursed celebration. One fateful night, a young woman named Elise ventured into the forest. Heartbroken after the death of her fiancé, she sought the pavilion, hoping to make a wish to bring him back. Guided by the sound of Victor's violin, Elise arrived at the ballroom, her breath taken by the sight of the skeletal bride and groom spinning gracefully across the cracked marble floor. The bride, Isabella, extended her bony hand toward Elise. "Will you join us in the dance?" she whispered, her voice echoing like the rustle of dry leaves. Desperate and unafraid, Elise nodded. "I will." As Elise joined their waltz, the violin's melody grew louder, filling the ballroom with an otherworldly resonance. She twirled across the floor, her feet moving instinctively to the rhythm. For a moment, she felt weightless, her grief melting away. But as the dance continued, she began to notice the other figures around her. Ghostly shapes watching silently, their hollow eyes fixed on her. "Do not falter," Isabella warned, her skeletal grin both comforting and menacing. "If you lose the rhythm, you will never leave." The music quickened, and Elise's heart raced. She could feel the pull of the curse, the way the ballroom seemed to tug at her soul. Yet she kept dancing, her resolve fueled by the memory of her fiancé. Finally, as the last note of the violin rang out, the ballroom fell silent. Elise collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. The bride and groom stood over her, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. "Your wish will be granted," Victor said, his voice soft and mournful. "But remember, all magic comes at a cost." Elise awoke in the forest, clutching the locket her fiancé had given her. When she returned to her village, she found her fiancé waiting for her, alive but changed. His eyes were distant, his smile hollow, as if a piece of his soul had been left behind in the ballroom. Elise soon realized that her wish had come at a terrible price. Every night, as the clock struck midnight, her fiancé would vanish, drawn back to the veiled pavilion to join the eternal waltz. No matter how far they fled, the melody of Victor's violin would find them, pulling him back to the cursed ballroom. Determined to break the curse, Elise returned to the forest, carrying the locket that now seemed to pulse with an otherworldly glow. As she entered the veiled pavilion, she found the ballroom more crowded than before, with new souls spinning endlessly in the spectral waltz. Isabella and Victor approached her, their skeletal hands still intertwined. You should not have returned, Isabella said, her voice heavy with sorrow. The curse cannot be undone. Only one choice remains. Elise held up the locket. I will take his place, she said, her voice trembling. Let him go. Let him live. The ballroom fell silent. Victor's violin hovered in the air, its strings humming with anticipation. Such sacrifice, Victor said, his hollow eyes gazing at her. But love cannot erase what has been bound by death. Despite their warnings, Elise stepped into the center of the ballroom. The violin began to play again, this time a mournful dirge. As Elise danced alone, her body began to wither, her flesh dissolving into mist. The other wraiths circled her, their hollow eyes filled with sorrow. When the music ended, Elise was gone. Her fiancé, now free from the curse, awoke in the village with no memory of what had transpired. But the veiled pavilion remained, and a new figure joined the eternal waltz. Elise, her skeletal form spinning gracefully beside Isabella and Victor, her sacrifice binding her to the cursed celebration forever. To this day, the ballroom continues to lure those desperate enough to make a wish. The violin's melody grows louder with each passing year, and the waltz becomes more crowded with the souls of the lost. Travelers speak of seeing 3 skeletal figures leading the dance: the bride, the groom, and the sacrifice. And on nights when the moon is full, the cursed music drifts beyond the forest, calling to those who yearn for something they cannot have. But beware, for those who enter the veiled pavilion may find themselves dancing forever, their souls bound to the endless rhythm of the eternal waltz.